Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Caroline Lucas, MP for Brighton Pavilion. You probably know her achievements. Green MEP from 1999 to 2010, the Green Party's first MP, from 2008 to 2012, the first solo leader of the party, and co-leader from 2016 to September 2018. As leader, she spoke of having a face the country recognises, and I'm sure that's true. For example, I'm sure she was recognised by the police anti-extremism unit, which monitored her for a number of years. And I expect the police who arrested her twice at CND protests in Faslane knew who she was too. She said at the time, it still seems ironic that it's a non-violent demonstration that's judged to be a breach of the peace, rather than Britain's illegal and immoral possession of nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, Caroline Lucas.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, and I'm really honoured to have been asked to speak at this important meeting this afternoon. Just to explain that quote, the first one, I wasn't saying I've got a face that people recognise. I was saying one of the arguments for having a leader of the Green Party would be to have someone whose face people recognise, which has its downsides as well as its good sides. But that was just the context for that. But it is a real pleasure to be among so many friends and colleagues, and an enormous privilege to be given the chance to talk about what I want to call active remembrance and what that means for us as peace activists. And what I mean by that is, sometimes when you think about the idea of remembrance, maybe it just sometimes feels a little bit like looking backwards, looking at what happened, and that is massively important. But the point of looking backwards is so that it informs what we then do today. And if looking backwards, if remembrance is only a passive thing to do that doesn't actually change the way we act in the light of that remembrance, then I think we're missing an important part of what I think remembrance should be about. So that's what I mean when I talk about active remembrance. And I know as well that maybe some of you might share some concerns that the annual ritual of remembering the horrors of war can itself occasionally seem like it has become a little bit about forgetting the actual horrors of war. And that in paying tribute to those who sacrificed their lives, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that too many of them actually didn't feel that they had any choice about that at all. And that those that do have choices today all too often fail to consider the alternatives before reaching for the tools of war. Glorifying the fallen can, if we're not very careful, lead to both the airbrushing of history and make it more difficult to rise up, to tell the truth about war and to resist. So remembering ought to be something active as well as passive. And throughout this lecture, I want to talk about ways to ensure that never forgetting is something we deliberately and dynamically do by waging peace instead. So as we approach Remembrance Sunday, and particularly during this 100th year anniversary of the armistice, we are especially reminded, I think, of the peace that has been built in Europe since 1945. Britain emerged from the rubble and destruction of the Second World War into a nation that has been at peace with its neighbours ever since. And in a way, that is something of a miracle that few might have dreamed was possible when the bombs were raining down on London and on countless other towns and cities in the middle of last century. And sadly, while Britain itself has very definitely continued to be a warmonger, as have many European nations, we mustn't let that allow us to forget the remarkable achievement of the EU, for which it was, rightly in my view, awarded a Nobel Peace Prize back in 2012. The Norwegian Nobel Committee paid tribute then to the stabilising role the EU has played in transforming most of Europe from a continent of war to a continent of peace. And it recognised the struggle for peace and reconciliation, as well as the ongoing struggles for democracy, for freedom, for justice, and human rights. Now, it's fair to say that in the 6 years since that prize was awarded, those EU values have been sorely tested, as indeed they have consistently been throughout its history. And it is easy to point to times when the EU has failed to live up to its aspirations. Take the frankly unforgivable decision to abandon the families and individuals crossing the Mediterranean, often fleeing conflict zones, and the subsequent hostility towards NGO search and rescue ships. Or the punishment and humiliation that was meted out to Greece for daring to challenge the whole ideology of austerity, treatment which was fundamentally at odds with that idea of the Fellowship of Nations to which Alfred Nobel assigned so much importance. And a betrayal too, I'd argue, of the role that Greece played in the forgiveness of Germany's debts in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's easy as well to point to the rise of nationalism and far-right political gains in countries from Finland to Italy to Cyprus and France. Part backlash against the political establishment in the wake of the financial and migrant crises, part a wave of discontent that taps into long-standing fears about globalization and the fear of that dilution of national identity. And then as well, there's the continued funding for military research, the drive for member states to spend more on defence and on the procurement of military equipment, the disproportionate influence of the arms industry on EU policymaking, the extent to which military and security companies have benefited from the refugee crisis, and in particular from the EU's investment in securing its borders, and the ongoing sales of arms to human rights abusers and dictators. And all of that is true. And yet, active remembrance means not losing sight of the positives whilst trying to change those negatives. It means not forgetting that things are rarely all good or all bad. So whilst I've always been vocal about the need to reform the European Union and move it away from neoliberal globalization and militarization, I've also always been a passionate defender of our continued membership of it. Because Europe, for me, has stood as a symbol of what we can achieve when we work cooperatively together. There is that sense of a symbol of peace. And when I was a member of the European Parliament, nothing was more moving than being in some of those, just in the corridors of the Parliament building in Brussels or Strasbourg, and hearing all of these languages being spoken, and just hearing that people, yes, they fall out with one another and they have horrendous arguments, but the idea that actually that is being worked through argument, through logic, through reason, through discussion, through talking and listening, rather than reaching for weapons, seemed to me genuinely something that was incredibly moving to hear on a daily basis in that Parliament. And one of the worst aspects of Brexit, to me, is the way that it has ignored, really, the most powerful and engaging reasons for our membership of the European Union. How the EU has helped avert war in Europe for 60 years. How, in spite of everything else that I have said, it has fostered democracy and the rule of law across the continent. How it has provided its citizens with the freedom to travel, to study, to work, to live and to love in 27 other member states, which I think is a cause for celebration, not a cause for trying to pretend it shouldn't exist. It is about the real enrichment, I think, that the European inheritance brings all of us. And during the referendum campaign, as I look back at it, I remember just how difficult that message was to get across. So perhaps it wasn't surprising that not so many people went to the ballot boxes thinking about the courage and the ambition and the vision that helped to create the EU. Because we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is an astonishing institution. It is pretty much unique in human history in the way that it's countries coming together voluntarily to share that famous word sovereignty that became such a touch paper really in the referendum campaign. And yes, of course it's imperfect, but do you know what? Anything that was ambitious as the European Union is going to be imperfect. It is, I still think, about lighting a candle rather than cursing the darkness. Yet, as I said, we heard little about that in 2016, and we've heard very little since as part of the campaign for a so-called people's vote, a say, in other words, on the final outcome of whatever happens with this Brexit process. All too often, I think, both the original referendum campaign and indeed, to some extent, the people's vote still seems to be about generating fear. But if remembrance has taught us anything, it is that fear rarely creates the conditions for positive change. More frequently, it begets violence and conflict. Now, I don't think that all the scare stories were all fiction, unfortunately. I think if Brexit goes ahead, we will pay a high economic price. But I think the greatest price we'll pay will be of a Britain that retreats into a narrow, inward-looking isolation, where weapons and money can go anywhere, but refugees are vilified and compassion is chased out of town. And I worry too about the harm being done to the development of a Europe that, whilst flawed, is nonetheless committed to the principle that we must try to pursue peace and progress. So as wagers of peace, I believe we have a responsibility not to throw all of that away, to stand by the principle that nations who share resources are at least more likely to value peace above war. And I believe, too, that we have a responsibility not to exacerbate the divisions and differences that have riven our nation, a duty to help the country heal, to unite again and embark on the next stage of this journey with an approach that is based on democracy and truth. Now, I call for people to continue to be involved in the process of decision-making just days after that 2016 referendum result. And that has snowballed now until just a few weeks ago here in the streets of London, over 500,000 people were demanding a say in whatever happens next. It's an amazing and growing movement, bringing people together of all ages and backgrounds and party allegiances. But what it hasn't yet done, despite our best efforts, I think, is to create a space for a narrative that is more about hope than about fear. And it hasn't reached out to those people who voted leave for very good reason. I think all too often we've fallen into a kind of a sense that people who voted leave somehow were ignorant, they didn't know what they were doing. Whereas I think there's a very strong argument to say that certainly a proportion of people who voted leave were right to think that the status quo in this country is intolerable. We are a country of grotesque inequality. I was really struck by the report from the Commission on Social Mobility, which looked at the 30 worst cold spots for social mobility in this country. In other words, those places where it was least possible to get on. And every single one of those 30 places voted to leave. Now, I don't think that is a coincidence. Almost even more shocking, there was also an analysis of the 10 poorest places in Northern Europe, and 7 of those were in the United Kingdom. I mean, that's hard to believe as we're just a stone's throw away from the City of London, which is one of the richest in the whole world. And that's what I mean by saying that if we're serious about reaching out to people, particularly in this context of Brexit, then we have to understand what led at least some people to feel that things couldn't get any worse and that shaking up the system was the only act that they had left, in a sense. So we face very different and new challenges today from those which the architects of the EU were dealing with, from climate change and the refugee crisis to international terrorism and, as I say, grotesque inequality. But what hasn't changed is that these challenges cross borders. They affect all of us. And that's why I continue to believe that we are stronger and safer if we work with our European neighbours to rise to those challenges, and that we have to work equally hard with the neighbours in our streets too, if we're to start, as I say, to address some of those emotions, those very legitimate grievances that led people to vote the way they did. And that brings me to the first action that I want to call on you to undertake as acts of remembrance. And first, to spread the word about what the EU has achieved in the name of peace and human rights. That doesn't mean being uncritical, but I hope it might mean making the case that we can better change the things that we need to change if we're still in the room, around the table, and actively engaged. Second, if you can, perhaps to join the campaign for a people's vote, no matter what you might have voted 2 years ago. I think it's right that this is still a process that is subject to democracy as we go forward. And thirdly, for those who did vote Remain and still want to remain, to reach out to those people who don't agree with us and to have those conversations with respect. I can't talk about Brexit without saying just a few words about Northern Ireland, where the cause of peace is potentially, at least, at risk again today. When Martin McGuinness died last year, there was a long debate about his legacy with very different views, whether he should be remembered as a terrorist or a peacemaker. And I said earlier about the EU that there's no such thing as being all good or all bad, and of course the same thing applies to individuals. And for me, waging peace must embrace the possibility that we can each individually become better versions of ourselves and be allowed to move on from the past. Believing the best of people is how we create the conditions for reconciliation. Brave individuals took enormous risks to deliver a peace settlement in Northern Ireland. And some have won awards for doing so, but many others will not even become footnotes in history. So let's pay tribute to all who've played a role in ending the conflict, whether it was bringing together political leaders or simply by being a friend to someone who was supposed to be an enemy. And let's ensure that their contribution to peace is not undermined by Brexit. The way this government has played politics with peace in Northern Ireland, I think, is reckless. And I think, were we to sacrifice the Good Friday Agreement on the altar of Brexit, it would be nothing short of criminal, and it must not be allowed to happen. So, as wagers of peace, I call on you to do what you can to help people remember recent history, the way that families were divided and destroyed during the Troubles, the violence, the stigmatizing, the despair, and again the fear that allowed hatred and nationalism to take hold and conflict to flourish. For whole generations alive today, this is ancient history. They have no memory of being at war with ourselves. But peace founders when people forget what its absence looks and feels like. So we have to resist the way in which war is consigned to the history books or something played out on our TV screens as something sanitized or distant. We must actively remember by sharing the reality and encouraging others to do the same. So we engage today in active remembrance, not just as citizens of this country or of the EU, but as global citizens too. And that means that we need to reflect on the fact that, of course, that global context continues to be riven by war as well. In the Middle East, in Afghanistan, the former Soviet Union, many countries in Africa. Millions of lives wasted, millions more maimed, traumatized, or forced to flee. And the seemingly endless cycles of terrorism and repression, one feeding off the other. World leaders have not only created war or fueled it for their own reasons, they've also blamed the victims. They turn their back on the refugees or they pander to the xenophobes who claim that those seeking asylum are some kind of threat to our way of life, rather than fellow humans who deserve our compassion and help. We've also had to witness the corruption and waste of the arms trade. Billions of pounds spent on unnecessary weapons, keeping whole nations in poverty and debt, so that even when those weapons are not actually being used, they still blight far too many lives. Yet even here, we can and we must point to progress. The fact that there are fewer people, fewer children in particular, growing up in poverty. The fact that there has been major progress on controlling diseases. The fact that in some parts of Latin America and Eastern Europe, democracy is taking root. And that the resolution of seemingly intractable conflicts is happening, none more so than in Northern Ireland. So yes, we have the proxy war in Ukraine, but we have also seen a fragile form of peace endure in the former Yugoslavia. We've seen the disaster of the invasion of Iraq, yet we've also seen full-scale war averted between India and Pakistan. And for those of us who are committed to the path of peace, and who understand that peace can only come through addressing issues such as social justice and climate change, we must bear witness to what is wrong and try to change it, but also draw encouragement from what has been achieved. And the lesson, I think, is this, is to know that we can and we do make a difference. We help shape public opinion. We influence the thinking of the elites. We can, some of the time at least, provide the setting in which world leaders make the right choices. I wanted to give an example of Harold Wilson, because as Prime Minister during the Vietnam War, he was under huge pressure from the Americans to commit troops to that conflict, as Australia did. And yet he refused, and maybe that wasn't for the right reasons. It might have been a political calculation, or maybe it was pressure from Labour MPs and party members, but the result was the same. That pressure worked. More recently, public opinion helped persuade MPs to reject David Cameron's call for armed intervention in Syria. And that intervention did come in the end, albeit to a different target, but there was at least a bit of time for reflection and to have established the principle that Parliament should vote on the decision to begin any military action. And we've seen this same mix of progress and regression on arms control. Biological weapons were banned in 1972, chemical weapons in 93, landmines in 97, cluster munitions in 2008. In each case, politicians and their advisors doing the right thing, even if we had to drag them there to get them to do it. And of course, that's where we are right now when it comes to nuclear weapons. Those nations with nuclear weapons, as we know, are intent on upgrading them, and the UK is foremost among the culprits. Not surprisingly, those non-nuclear states, when they see the nuclear states not disarming as they promised to do, but actually increasing the aggression of their weapons, are feeling that they also should be part of this race. We have no moral high ground to be lecturing North Korea or Iran about not developing nuclear weapons while we go ahead and burnish our own. And the fact is that the UK has not once in 50 years entered any of its nuclear weapons into the multilateral nuclear negotiations. It's spending up to $200 billion on a weapons system that will be redundant before it's even delivered, with the developments in underwater technology likely to uncloak our submarines within decades. And we know that Trident is useless against today's threats, and what it does do is to fuel the threat of nuclear proliferation. Globally, there are at least 16,000 nuclear weapons in existence, with the US and Russia holding 90% of them. And now, as we know, just a few weeks ago, President Trump has withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, Kate Hudson, chair of CND, has warned that that will mark the end of the restraints on nuclear arsenals that were achieved in the 1980s. She says it will open the way for the return to Europe of cruise-type missiles that can have only one purpose, that of a US nuclear war against Russia being fought in Europe. It is bleak, of course it's bleak. But maybe, just maybe, there's a tiny sign of hope even here. On Remembrance Sunday, President Trump and Putin plan to meet in France to discuss the INF further. And if there's one thing we know about President Trump so far, is that consistency is not one of his strong points. So the fact that he's announced one thing on one day of the week doesn't mean to say that he might not, perhaps, announce exactly the opposite a few weeks later. And whilst the US, the UK and Russia are amongst those countries that have not yet signed the UN Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, 19 have already ratified it. There's every reason to believe that the 50 required for it to come into force can be secured by the end of next year. It is an amazing achievement that over 127 states support that nuclear ban treaty, especially in Africa and Latin America. And as we know, it is the Europeans who are most resistant, and the UK in particular. I was lucky enough to be in New York for some of the talks around the nuclear ban treaty. And I was so horrified to see the seat that had the United Kingdom label in front of it being empty that I went and sat at it. And it didn't go down very well. Actually, the news got back to the ambassador, and he actually wrote to me afterwards to say that this was not the done thing. But that global ban treaty, as you will know, is sorely needed. The INF prohibited missiles were meant to wipe out citizen Europe, and we are witnessing a new nuclear arms race. The awarding of last year's Nobel Peace Prize to the campaigners behind the treaty and the focus on stigmatizing nuclear weapons, just as treaties before have marginalized landmines and cluster munitions, all of that represent a wonderful turning of the tide. So I say again that we can and we do make a difference. And our active remembrance must recognize too the significant role that mass protests and mobilizations against nuclear escalation and cruise missiles have played in securing the INF Treaty in the first place, not least, of course, the protests at Greenham Peace Camp. So let's never forget that we are making progress, even if at times it can feel that it is far too slow and it's undermined by a step backwards for every one we take forwards. Because remembering what we have achieved makes us more effective change makers going forward. It helps us to hold on to the kind of hope that the wonderful writer Rebecca Solnit talks about. And there's a lot of discussion about hope. Is hope some sort of fluffy thing that is, completely naive? Or is hope something really strong that can keep you going in the darkest times? And Rebecca Solnit, who is a wonderful writer, she talks about hope not as a lottery ticket that you sit in the dark clutching, feeling lucky, but hope being a powerful force that shoves you out of the door. And she writes this, she says, "It will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable." So to more effectively wage peace, we need to shift that balance towards the positives that fill us with that kind of hope that she talks about. If we want to transform the future into one that's safe for everyone, we must keep remembering and learning and actively making the difference. Now, it's easy to think that we are living through a unique moment in history. Many people, I'm sure everyone who lives through time gone by always think they're living at a unique time. But I would argue that when it comes to our impact on the natural world, there is no denying there is something very special about this moment. That all of us in this room are the first generation to know the damage that we're doing to the environment, and more scarily, perhaps the last generation with a real chance to do something about it before it's too late. Because we know at the start of the 21st century, the biggest threat to all of us is the ecological crisis, a planet exploited beyond its natural limits. And failing to address that will vastly increase the likelihood of future conflicts. From a national security perspective, as well as every other perspective, it makes no sense to be investing in weapons of mass destruction that are utterly useless in the face of organized crime, of terrorism, of cyber warfare, of pandemics, but of more than anything else, of the environmental crisis and climate change. And it's interesting to me that the Ministry of Defence actually does understand that the major strategic threats of the future are ecological, and the Pentagon do similarly. They recognise that coastal flooding or climate-driven migration or rising food prices due to drought and water stress will be some of the most significant drivers of insecurity and therefore potential conflict into the future. So major security experts in the UN and around the world all agree that climate change should be top of the political agenda when it comes to those risks to our security. And we look around us and we see deepening threats to the sustainability on which we absolutely depend. And to feed our lifestyles, we have stolen from the future, and indeed from countries and peoples who are weaker than ourselves. But we're not actually free from the consequences of that. The loss of habitats, the changes to our climate, the risks of disease, flooding, drought and storms will affect us here as well. And that's what made it so shocking to me that on the very day that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that we have just 12 years to get off the collision course we're currently on with climate catastrophe, just on that same week and day that the IPCC, the world's top scientists, were telling us of this enormous risk, the response of our government was to give the green light to fracking. Now, fracking is a whole new fossil fuel industry, and we are giving the green light to that fossil fuel industry at exactly the same time that we know that we need to leave 80% of known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're to have a hope of avoiding catastrophic climate change. And if that hadn't been enough just a few weeks ago, just a few days ago, you might have seen a report from the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. They produce regularly something they call the Living Planet Index. And that shows that since 1970, so just in the last 40 or so years, humanity has wiped out 60% of our populations of mammals, of birds, of fish, and of reptiles. Now, to give you a proportionate sense of that scale of loss, it's like the entire human populations of North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania disappearing. The vast and growing consumption of food and resources is destroying the web of life, billions of years in the making, upon which our society ultimately depends for clean air, for clean water, and everything else. And that annihilation of wildlife is now an emergency that threatens civilization and will, if we don't take serious action soon, potentially fuel future wars, just as previous wars have been fought over access to precious but scarce resources. The evidence could scarcely be any stronger. Yet rather than an emergency budget on Monday of this last week, we had a budget where the Chancellor didn't even mention the words climate change. Those two words did not pass his lips. And when you actually look at what was in that budget, sadly there was very little that was going to help with the multiple challenges that we face when it comes to environment and climate change. To the contrary, what we've seen is more and more investment in fossil fuels, subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, more investment in road building. We've seen basically a failure to do the things that make sense in themselves, like insulating our homes or massively investing in energy efficiency and green energy. So what we need to see, I think, is a real change of approach. Because what we've got is a profound moral failure from a generation of politicians who, frankly, won't live to see the devastation that their failure to act will wreak on future generations. And in the face of all that, I have to say that my resolution to find hope everywhere is tested. But even here, again, just something I found in the papers just last week, it was that Spain has announced that it's going to shut down its coal mines by the end of this year. And what was particularly exciting about their plans was that they recognise the interconnectedness of environmental and social justice. So as well as closing the coal mines, what they're going to do is to invest over £200 million in those mining regions over the next decade. So they'll invest in things like early retirement schemes for older miners, but also training for younger miners so that they can learn different trades. They're going to invest in environmental restoration in those pit communities, reskilling. It makes sure that no one is forgotten, it innovates, it demonstrates that you don't have to choose between the environment on the one hand and jobs on the other. It is possible with a bit of vision to have both. But if containing climate change is a bit like a war, then it's one that we are right now losing despite victory in some battles. And it's a vicious cycle, with climate change adding further stress to a struggling global economy, undermining global cooperation, which in turn slows or even halts efforts to tackle the problem. And all the while, the temperature rises. And of course, it's true that we can't deal with the ecological crisis in isolation. Economic mismanagement is wrecking our climate. Climate change is creating droughts that destabilise whole nations, foster conflict, and create new flows of refugees. And that in turn creates the political instability and the risks. So active remembrance demands that we completely shift our mindset, understanding that waging peace can't happen in isolation either. That it must be done by joining up the different campaigns that we're all involved in. Things like being in solidarity with those brave people who stopped those deportation flights from leaving Stansted Airport, or those amazing people who staff food banks, or the pioneers of community-owned energy and banks, or the occupiers of the diggers, or those brave people in Preston New Road who were opposing that fracking and went to prison for it and were only just recently acquitted. Many of these campaigns might seem unconnected, but if you get to the heart of them, they are about how we live on this planet and how we relate to one another. And those connections have got to be made. But if you leave today with just one takeaway pledge, then make it to seek out and act in solidarity with others that are part of this much wider movement that underpins and interacts with our campaign for peace. Because active remembrance requires that we pause to reflect on the kind of people we are and the kind of world we want to build. We know that the world doesn't have to be the way it is right now, with poverty and war and inequality. But to create a different world, we have to act differently. There's that old saying, isn't there, that to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result is one of the definitions of insanity. So, in terms of what we might do differently, as well as the investment in green energy and energy efficiency and different transport modes when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, I think we need to grapple with the heretical thought that economic growth might just not be the be-all and end-all of everything we always do. Because unless we tackle our production and consumption methods, even if we make some of that a little bit more efficient, then it's not going to be enough to get us off the collision course we're on. So nowadays you'll find businesses and everyone else being very happy to talk about efficiency. You'll find very few people who want to have a conversation about sufficiency. And that, I think, is the challenge for us as Wagers of Peace. There's a wonderful anthropologist called Jason Hickel, and he's written some wonderful articles just recently. And in one of them, responding to this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, he says this. He says, "It will be difficult to overstate how dramatic this trajectory is." In other words, trying to do everything in 12 years. "It requires nothing less," he says, "than a total and rapid reversal of our present direction as a civilization. After decades of delay, this is our last chance to get it right." And he talks about the importance of recognizing that growth, as we currently understand it, of more and more stuff, basically an economic model that is based on digging stuff out of the ground on one side of the world, shipping it to people to use in the middle, and then disposing of it on the other side of the world, that model has got to change. And there's a wonderful quote from Kenneth Boulding, who basically said that anyone who thinks that infinite economic growth is possible on a planet of finite resources is either a madman or an economist. So, what Jason Hickel in his articles reminds us is that in this short period that we have to get our emissions down to what they call net zero, that's basically 30 years to do that, that is due to happen at the same time that economic projections suggest that the global economy is set to triple. It would be hard enough if the economy was going to stay the same size between now and 2050, but trying to utterly decarbonize it and get down to zero emissions at the same time as that economy is growing by a factor of 3 demonstrates, I think, the scale of the challenge that we face. And it does mean that what we need is nothing short of absolutely changing the logic that we work on today. And again, to quote from Jason Hickel, he says, "It means moving away from disposable products towards good that last. It means repairing our existing things rather than buying new ones. It means designing things so that they can be repaired. It means investing in public goods and finding ways to share stuff, from cars to lawnmowers, shifting from an ethic of ownership to an ethic of usership." And I think waging peace together to tackle the ecological crisis requires that system-level change. A new global economy of sharing, of participation and collaboration, redistributing power and wealth and jobs, providing genuine security in a world liberated from the threats that we face today. And it means absolutely standing up to the media, to standing up to some of the big companies who have vested interests in getting us to carry on consuming. The advertising industry in particular, of course, makes it its mission to make us feel terrible. It's really weird, isn't it, to have an industry that's set up to make us feel really bad. But that's what the advertising industry does. It tells us we're not good enough, we're not beautiful enough, we're not sexy enough, unless we go out and buy some more stuff. And Professor Tim Jackson has a wonderful phrase when he talks about basically the advertising industry is persuading us to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last, on people we don't even care about. So that is our challenge. And the first thing to say is that, as with the example of Spain that I gave earlier, we need to be thinking about the win-wins. You know, when Spain was thinking about closing its coal mines, it also saw the opportunity to actually get people employed in industries that were more useful and effective. And I think that we've got to remember that in this big transition that we're talking about, it isn't all about hair shirts. It's not about, you know, sitting around a candle in a cave. It's about an opportunity to get our lives in harmony with nature around us. And the good news is that this is something that could be incredibly positive. I wanted to tell you about one of my favorite cartoons that has a professor in front of a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard she has written all of the advantages of moving to a zero carbon economy, like, you know, homes that are properly insulated so people don't die of fuel poverty, or like local affordable food that is grown organically rather than being shipped from the other side of the world, or public transport that is properly affordable so people don't have to keep being in their cars, or shorter working weeks so that people could spend more time with their family, or kids being able to play out in the streets again. And then there's a speech bubble coming from one of her students in the lecture theatre saying, "But what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason?" So this is about creating a better world. That is the prize for us here, I think. And that is the exciting thing, that there are plenty of scientists out there. There was a meeting in Brussels just last month. 238 scientists came together at a conference called GDP and Beyond. And basically they made a very powerful case to say that we can improve people's lives and provide meaningful work for everybody without any more production and consumption of more and more stuff. We just have to get better at distributing it more fairly. So part of our role as peace activists, I think, is to change perceptions and understanding and to build belief in alternatives. The politicians and the business owners making big decisions are still people, and so too are those around them, the advisors, the technocrats, the investors, the workforce, the scientists, the generals. And they in turn have friends and colleagues and family who maybe are more open to different ways of seeing the world. And so we do still here have the potential for influence. We live in such an interconnected world. We are, it's said, just 5 connections away from every other human on the planet. It might be strange to think that we are just 5 connections away from the sailors on a Trident submarine, or the technicians at Menwith Hill, or the sales team at British Aerospace. But if it's true, then what a wonderful opportunity that is. So when we sign a petition, when we go on a demonstration, when we write to a newspaper, or when we simply talk to our friends and family about the issues that matter, we have the chance to exercise that influence, to challenge preconceptions and maybe even to shift perceptions a little bit. Active remembrance means seizing every opportunity that comes our way. And when it comes to world leaders or the military and security apparatus, it feels harder, of course. It's more like an armed standoff trying to talk with them sometimes. It's a bit as if we're in our trenches and they're in theirs. We trade arguments, perhaps insults. We struggle to find common ground. Many of you will perhaps share my memories of standing at the fence at Greenham Common, all of us having that same experience of wanting to reach out to the people on the other side, whether that's the police or the army. The very setting creates the division. We're tempted to see each other as enemies. And yet, at the same time, when you do reach out, quite often the most extraordinary conversations can happen. And to believe that the human race can be better than the endless future of war and oppression is part of that hope that makes you put your arm out and make those connections, and to put flowers in the fences around those nuclear bases. And if we're to be true to our principles, as people who are waging peace, it must be us who step out of our trenches first. It's a nice idea, you might say, but how on earth do we make this happen in practical terms? And in part, that is the conversation our wider movement needs to have going forward. But I have just a few suggestions, particularly about peace and security. First, that we're clear that greater engagement should not and must not mean the sacrifice of a single one of our principles or our policies. It's not about junking what matters. It's about finding new ways to converse with others and explain our case. The second is that we draw upon our strengths, particularly those who have already found ways to engage with those whose minds we need to change. And we have such amazing people as part of our movement. Then that's a huge resource that we can draw on. I'm thinking of people, of course, like the wonderful Bruce Kent in our first row here, and he'll be furious with me afterwards for picking him out, but I'm going to anyway. but an inspiration to so many people. People like Paul Rogers, the professor of peace studies at Bradford University, Rebecca Johnson, who's done so much when it came to that peace treaty, the nuclear ban treaty. But all of you, all of us, are making a difference. And my third and final suggestion is that we should be a bit ambitious about what we as a wider movement are going to do. And if you take the UK's national security strategy, that sounds like a very grand thing. Unfortunately, it's pretty rubbish. It's ill thought through, it's badly expressed, and most of all, it doesn't engage with the key issues. The respected British defence think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, has said of climate change that from a defence perspective, there is a danger that the military will be ill-equipped, under-resourced, and underprepared. That, to me, seems a bit of an understatement. Climate change doesn't even appear in any of the 3 national security objectives. So our admirals and our generals are on record expressing their grave concerns about the threat from climate change. It's about time governments reflected that in these strategies. And that got me thinking that maybe, we should be working with the environment groups, the development groups, the climate change, the refugee groups, and maybe coming together to make our own national security strategy. And just think a little bit how different it would look. It would be tackling problems at source, giving people hope and a stake in their communities. It would be building up international institutions. It would be curtailing the arms trade. It would be investing in real peacekeeping. It would be a new approach to international trade talks, because globalization shouldn't be about handing power to multinational corporations. It should be about a renewal of our commitment to human rights and civil liberties. It should be about basically reinstating the truth as something of value. It should be about things like contraction and convergence, which is essentially a model of addressing climate change, which means that the poorer countries are given more space to grow, while we in the richer countries basically contract our emissions even faster to give them more space. And maybe even a new Lucas plan, and I'm not naming that after myself, but referring to the plan that was developed 40 years ago by workers at the Lucas Aerospace Company. And many of you will be familiar with the story, but it continues to give me inspiration that 40 years ago, the workers at the Lucas Aerospace Company challenged their management, who wanted to continue making military goods and indeed at the same time getting rid of lots of jobs. They challenged them to say, why don't we think about what our skills in this factory could be used for that would be more useful? And they set out a whole strategy about how that Lucas Aerospace plant could instead be about investing in and creating the tools for energy conservation and renewable energy and so on. The network Rethinking Security has done some excellent work in this whole area about identifying things that could be crucial when it comes to shifting resource allocations away from costly military capabilities towards preventive and peace-building measures instead. And they call the Rethinking Security Group, they call as well for the public to be involved in this discussion about our security priorities. So waging peace hand in hand with every citizen and with a commitment to expecting the best. So as I draw to a close, I was reflecting on those words that we say every year at Remembrance Time. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. And we must and we will remember them. But what better way to honour all of those who've been taken away from us in the name of war than by actively building a world where we truly do never forget. So let me give you one final example of what I think active remembrance looks like. And actually it looks like all of you in this room, because our leaders don't have the answers. Tune into Prime Minister's questions, you have any doubt about that, and you will see very clearly that our leaders do not have the answers. And I think that means that gives us more of a chance to influence thinking for the better, because we've been asking the right questions for far longer than they have, and we've got some of the right answers too. And so I think we've got a real opportunity to help set the terms of the debate, to challenge outdated models of security, to put new emphasis on promoting security and peace through economic and ecological justice. Because there is no, as yet unfound group of people who are going to lead us into the safety and security of peace. We are it, all of us and the people outside who share our objectives. We are the present, and that means we are the future too. And so So, my friends, my fellow wagers of peace, the most effective way we can engage in active remembrance is to never forget that we can and we do make that difference, and to use that memory to bring new energy and power and the force of hope to our quest. Thank you.